On the 25th of September, 1066, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada stood on a bridge in Yorkshire with an arrow through his throat. He'd sailed to England with roughly 300 longships and an ambition about the size of the North Sea. He was the last great Viking king, a man who'd fought in Russia, served as a bodyguard for the emperor in Constantinople, come home rich enough to buy a country, and then decided to buy England too. He got about 7 miles east of York. By that evening, his army was so comprehensively finished that of the 250 to 300 ships that carried them over, 24 were enough to carry the survivors home. Historians generally mark that moment, that bridge, that arrow, as the end of the Viking Age. 19 days later, England was conquered. Not by Saxons, not by the French, by a duke from Normandy called William, whose bloodline ran back 5 generations to a Norse warlord named Rollo, a Viking who'd sailed up the Seine, made life in Paris genuinely unpleasant, and been handed a large piece of northern France essentially as a bribe to stop. So sit with that timeline for a second. In the autumn of 1066, a Viking died trying to take England, and a Viking took England, same season, same island, roughly the same bloodline. And nobody called the winner a Viking, not the chroniclers, not the survivors, not the history books. He was a Norman, Christian, French-speaking, cavalry riding, castle building. And the men he beat would have called him a foreigner without ever once noticing he was the same kind of foreigner they'd spent 270 years running from. That's the whole story right there. Because here's what everyone gets wrong about the Vikings. We treat their ending like a defeat. Terrifying raiders show up, wreck Europe for 3 centuries. Europe finally gets its act together and puts them down. Roll credits, horned helmets in the mud. Except they were never wearing horned helmets. A monastery on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria. Small correction, because this is the kind of thing that gets a History Channel roasted in the comments. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle actually says January. It's generally accepted the scribe made a mistake, and June makes far more practical sense. You don't cross the North Sea in an open boat in January unless you hate yourself. Lindisfarne was the spiritual heart of Northumbria. It held the bones of St. Cuthbert. It was stuffed with gold, silver, and illuminated manuscripts, and it was defended by, essentially, God. That worked out about as well as you'd expect. The raid took a few hours. The shockwave took years. A Northumbrian scholar named Alcuin, writing from the Frankish court, essentially said that nobody had ever imagined such a horror could arrive from the sea, because that was the actual problem. Europe's defensive thinking assumed threats came overland. These people arrived at 10 in the morning from a direction nobody was watching. Here's the part everyone skips, though. Lindisfarne wasn't the first. Years earlier, 3 ships had landed at Portland in southern England. A royal official named Bejuherd rode down to escort the strangers to the king, presumably to sort out the paperwork. They killed him. So the first recorded English response to the Viking Age was a bureaucrat going down to the beach to collect a tax. I find that genuinely perfect. Now, since we're doing corrections, the helmets. There is not one single horned helmet from Viking Age Scandinavia. Not one. The only complete Viking helmet ever found is the G-German Bu helmet, dug up in Norway in 1943, plain rounded iron and horn-free. The horns come from Bayreuth, Germany, in 1876, at the premiere of Wagner's Ring Cycle. A costume designer named Karl Emil Doppler needed his brutish warrior character to read from the cheap seats, so he stuck horns on the helmet. He gave the Valkyries wings. The image escaped into 19th century art, then illustrated histories, then cartoons, sports logos, and Halloween aisles. In Old Norse, a Vikinger is a person and Viking is an activity, an expedition, usually overseas, usually by sea, usually with a crew. It carried no ethnic meaning at all. You could use it about your own side or the other side. It was a job, and an occasional one at that, closer to a seasonal gig than an identity. which means calling all medieval Scandinavians Vikings is roughly like calling all Americans commuters. So what were the other 11 months? Farming mostly, fishing, ironwork, trade, and this is the part that just got dramatically upgraded: manufacturing. In June 2026, archaeologists at the Mosgard Museum announced a Viking Age site at Soffen, about 6 miles north of Aarhus in Denmark. It covers more than 100,000 square meters, with over 80 pit houses and a dedicated area for processing flax. It dates from roughly AD 600 to 950. The archaeologist who led the 10-month dig said the clear focus on textile production is what makes the settlement different. As one of the team put it, a production site at that scale can't be explained by local demand. It only makes sense as part of a much larger international network. Read that again: not a raiding camp, a factory town feeding an export market 400 years before anyone thought Europe had one. And while we're demolishing things, they were not filthy. Combs turn up constantly in graves. Contemporary complaints exist about Norse settlers in England being altogether too successful with local women, attributed to the fact that they combed their hair, bathed weekly, and changed their clothes. The old Scandinavian word behind Saturday literally means washing day. Yes, an Arab traveler called them the filthiest of God's creatures. He also washed 5 times a day for prayer. Standards are relative. So hold the real picture in your head: a farming, weaving, trading, co-moning society at the edge of Europe. Because here's what the raiding was actually for. It wasn't rage, it was capital. The ship was the technology, shallow enough to run up a beach or a river, seaworthy enough to cross open ocean. It meant a Norse crew could go places no army could follow, and every river in Europe stopped being a border and started being a road. So they took the roads. West Ireland, where they founded Dublin; England, where they took York; Scotland, the Isle of Man, Normandy, Sicily. East, and this is the half nobody makes videos about, they went down the Russian rivers. Norse traders called the ruse set up along the Volga and the Dnieper, and helped found the towns that became Novgorod and Kiev. Their word may well be sitting inside the name Russia right now. And they kept going until they hit the richest city in the world, Constantinople. The Norse called it Miklagard, the great city, and the emperors there, watching these enormous northerners arrive with axes, made an executive decision that is either brilliant or insane. They hired them. The Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, staffed by Norsemen. Remember the man dying on that bridge in Act 1? Harald Hardrada served in Constantinople before he ever came for England. The last Viking king was a Byzantine security contractor first. Follow the money further, and it gets stranger. Arab silver coins keep turning up in Scandinavian hoards, which means the trade lines ran from a Danish farmyard all the way to Baghdad. And then they went the other way. Iceland, Greenland, and then across the Atlantic, a settlement on the northern tip of Newfoundland at Elance Ox Meadows. For 60 years we could only say around the year 1000. Then researchers used a solar storm from the early 990s that spiked radiocarbon in tree rings worldwide as a reference marker, and counted rings on 3 separate pieces of wood cut with metal blades. All 3 converged on the same year. The study calls it the only secure calendar date for Europeans across the Atlantic before Columbus. 471 years early. These people were not barbarians at the gates of civilization. They were the circulatory system of it. Which brings us to the fatal move, not a battle, a business decision. For about 70 years the model was simple: sail in, take, sail out. Low overhead, high margin, no responsibilities. Then in 865, a force landed in England that historians call the Great Heathen Army, and it didn't leave. It wintered, it took York, it killed kings, and within a decade Norse settlers were farming across a huge stretch of northern and eastern England under a set of arrangements known as the Danelaw. Sword traded for plow. And on the continent, the French tried something even more direct. In 911, after a failed Viking siege of Chartres, the king of West Francia signed a treaty at St. Clair-sur-Epte with a Norse warlord called Rollo. He handed over farmable coastal land. In exchange, Rollo swore loyalty and agreed to fight off the other Vikings raiding that coastline. Read that deal again, because it's the whole video. France solved its Viking problem by making a Viking a landlord and putting him on the payroll. That territory is Normandy, literally land of the Northmen. And this is the trap, because the instant you own land, everything inverts. A raider has nothing to lose, that's his entire competitive advantage. A landowner has fields, tenants, a border, a title, and a very strong interest in nobody sailing up his river and doing to him what he built his career doing to everyone else. Rollo's men married local women. They hadn't brought many Norse women with them, so within a generation the household language was the local one. Their sons were christened. Their grandsons spoke French. Their great-grandsons rode horses into battle instead of beaching ships, and built stone castles instead of burning them. Nobody conquered them. Nobody converted them at sword point. They simply accepted the offer. Every Viking who took a deal like that was still, technically, winning. Think about why monasteries were such perfect targets, undefended, coastal, and packed with treasure. Yes, but there's a colder reason underneath. You can only rob a holy place enthusiastically if you don't think it's holy. Christian Europe couldn't raid its own churches, not because it was nicer, but because the whole system, kings, oaths, land, legitimacy, ran through the church. Loot a monastery and you're not committing theft, you're committing treason against the entire operating system. The Norse weren't on that system. To them, Lindisfarne wasn't a cathedral. It was an unguarded warehouse with a very optimistic security policy. And then, over about a century and a half, they joined the system. Around 965, a Danish king called Harald Bluetooth, yes, that Bluetooth, your headphones are named after him, raised a rune stone at Jelling. The inscription says he won all of Denmark and Norway for himself, and made the Danes Christian. One face carries an image of Christ. It's the oldest such depiction in Denmark. Historians will tell you the claim is political spin. The conversion was messier and slower than one stone suggests, and the dating itself is still argued over. But that's almost the point. Harold wasn't recording a spiritual awakening. He was advertising a credential. Christian kings got recognized by other Christian kings. They got trade, marriage alliances, legitimacy, and a seat at the European table. Paganism at that moment stopped being a faith and started being a barrier to entry. So Denmark converted, Norway converted. Iceland, by tradition, settled the question at its national assembly around the year 1000. And the moment those kingdoms went Christian, the raiding didn't become impossible. It became something worse for business. It became rude. Viking raiding was never a national program. There was no Norse war ministry. It was startups. A man with a ship, a reputation, and 30 guys who fancied their chances would sail off, and everyone took a cut. Decentralized, entrepreneurial, wildly profitable. That model needed two conditions. Europe had to stay soft, and home had to stay loose. Both closed. Europe learned. Alfred of Wessex built a network of fortified towns, so a raiding party that came inland had a garrison behind it and a wall in front of it. The Franks fortified their bridges specifically to stop longships from going upriver. Coastal watch systems went up. Local lords stopped panicking and started organizing. The raid stopped being a smash and grab and became a siege, and sieges cost money, time, and men. The margins died. Meanwhile, home changed shape. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were consolidating from a mess of chieftains into actual kingdoms with actual kings. And a king has a very specific relationship with the freelance raiding sector, which is that he hates it. Independent war bands with their own ships and their own fortunes aren't an asset to a monarch. They're rivals. A king wants taxes, tithes, a standing military he controls, and a monopoly on violence. So the same men who once got rich raiding got a new offer at home. Serve the crown, hold land, pay in, be respectable. And notice how neatly the three blades fit. The deals gave them something to lose. Christianity took away the license. Kings took away the freedom. Not one of those is a defeat. Every single one of them is a form of success. The Viking didn't get killed. He got a mortgage, a baptism, and a boss. Which is how you end an era without anybody noticing its ending. There's no last battle. There's no final stand. September 25th, Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York. Harold Hardrada, the last king who still believed the old model worked, who'd fought from Kiev to Constantinople and come home rich enough to try for England, takes an arrow to the throat. Of the 250 to 300 ships that brought his army over, 24 take the survivors home. Historians often mark that as the end of the Viking Age. The last man doing it the old way one last time, and losing. 19 days later, on October 14th, at Hastings, William of Normandy destroys the English army and takes the country. William is a direct descendant of Rollo, the Viking who took the deal in 911. 5 generations. That's it. That's the entire distance between a Norse warlord raiding the Seine and a duke conquering England. But look at what William is by 1066. He speaks French. He worships in Latin. He fights on horseback, which no Viking did. He builds castles instead of burning them. He carries a papal banner. And when he's crowned at Westminster on Christmas Day, the ceremony is a Christian, continental, feudal coronation of the kind Lindisfarne's monks would have recognized instantly, and Hardrada's crew would not have recognized at all. There is not one person at that coronation calling him a Viking. So here's what actually happened in the autumn of 1066. The Viking who stayed a Viking died in a Yorkshire field, and the Viking who'd stopped being one took the throne. The Viking Age didn't end at Stamford Bridge. It ended in a French field in 911, when a king handed a raider a deed, and the raider took it, and neither of them understood what had just been traded. That's the thing about the Vikings. We tell it as a horror story that Europe survived. It isn't. It's an absorption story. They went everywhere, sold everything, married in, converted, took the land, took the titles, took the throne of England, and somewhere in all that winning, they stopped being the thing that scared everyone. They didn't lose. They dissolved into the continent they terrorized, and it's still full of them. Nobody conquered the Vikings.